That's the definition of triggers. Now, one thing that I want to tell you is most people can tell you an example of what a trigger is. But many people can't tell you what makes a trigger a trigger. In fact, there's many people that work in this profession that aren't like, they don't really teach what makes a trigger a trigger. And if we don't know what makes a trigger, the only thing that we can teach you to do as a patient is to avoid triggers, right? If we don't know what makes them a trigger, how are we going to recover from triggers, right? So if we don't know what makes it a trigger, we can't recover from them, and then the only thing we're left with is to teach you how to avoid them. Now, how much success you're going to think you're going to have living in this society, you know, avoiding drinking and using situations for the rest of your life? Probably not very successful. Alcohol permeates our society, right? And so eventually, you're going to have to recover from these triggers and not just avoid them. You might be saying, recover from them? You can actually recover from triggers? Yes, and we're going to show you in just a minute. I gave you this definition of triggers, and when I first started out in my career, and I was doing this lecture over at St. John's, and coming off of my alcohol and drug studies program, I used to use the analogy of classical conditioning, or Pavlovian conditioning. Then I went to school and got a degree in psychology, and found out it's not an analogy at all. It's exactly what it is. This is Pavlovian or classical conditioning in its purest form, right? You ever heard of Pavlov's dogs? Right? So Pavlov is this Russian scientist who was doing digestion studies. So he had this dog in this apparatus, and he had like a little tube hooked into its mouth, and they were measuring salivation level, right? And so they had a machine that emitted meat powder, and so the meat powder would come down the chute, and then the dog would see the meat powder and then salivate, and then, you know, the salivation meter would go off. Well, one day, Dr. Pavlov, wearing his lab coat, walks into the lab, and all of a sudden, the salivation level starts going off, and they didn't even show the dog the meat powder. So Pavlov's going, wow, isn't that interesting? There seems to be some connection made between me and the meat powder. So he decided to study this. So it changed from a digestion study into like a psychological study, really. And so what they did was they tried to emulate this. So they added a third variable, right, which was a baritone. We'll just call it a bell. So what they did was they tried to make a connection, the same kind of connection between the bell and the meat powder, right, to see if the dog would still salivate. So what they did was they rang the bell, presented the meat powder, and the dog salivated. And they did this repeatedly. Bell, meat powder, salivation. Bell, meat powder, salivation. And what they eventually found is they could ring the bell, not present the meat powder, and the dog would still salivate, right? So for our purposes, the bell was the trigger. That event that happened just before or simultaneous to the presentation of the meat powder, which caused the dog to salivate or crave, if you will, the dog's drug of choice, if you will, meat powder, right? So what we're trying to do is help you figure out, what is your bell, right? What is that event that happened just before or simultaneous to your use that activates the craving cycle, okay?